Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we deliver the shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we are taking you into a story of, well, absolute audacity, brutal survival, and strategic miscalculation. And it all plays out on the highest battlefield on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
We are heading up, way up, to the peaks of Kargil. Back in the summer of 1999, the air itself was practically a weapon.
It really was.
And diplomacy, well, it was exposed as, frankly, a complete sham.
Yeah, this was a localized but incredibly intense conventional war fought between India and Pakistan at absolutely staggering elevations. We're talking upwards of 18,000 feet.
18,000, just think about that.
And what makes this conflict so astonishing is the timing, the context. Just months before this kicked off, the leaders of both countries had signed the Lahore Declaration.
Right, the bus diplomacy, peace initiatives.
Exactly. Promising peace, non-aggression, dialogue, all of it. So the military intrusion that followed in Kargil, well, it wasn't just an attack. It was a profound and, very calculated act of strategic surprise, a real stab in the back, diplomatically speaking.
So our mission today is to really uncover the dramatic story behind this high-altitude ambush. We want to understand the elaborate deception that allowed the invasion to happen in the first place.
And the sheer grueling reality of fighting at that altitude. It pushes human limits like almost nothing else.
Absolutely. And then the critical strategic shifts, both on the battlefield and in the diplomatic arena, that ultimately decided how this thing ended.
We've pulled together a whole range of sources for you. There's some really in-depth JNU assessments. That's from Jawaharlal Nehru University's School of International Studies, widely seen as, the top-tier analysis of the conflict.
The gold standard, really.
Plus detailed military analyses, firsthand accounts, eyewitness reports from the front lines. We've tried to synthesize it all.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're dissecting Operation Badur, that was Pakistan's code name for the infiltration, right?
And Operation Vijay, which was India's massive counteroffensive. The core questions are, how did an attack this big go unnoticed for so long? And how did the Indian forces have to adapt, basically invent new ways of fighting to win in a place that just fundamentally rewrites the rules of modern warfare?
Okay, so to really get the ambush, we first need to quickly set the stage. And that stage, inevitably, is Kashmir. It's the foundational dispute, isn't it?
It is. Kashmir was always unique. Right back at partition in 47, you had this situation. A Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, governing a majority Muslim population.
Which immediately complicates the whole two-nation theory that Pakistan was built on.
Precisely. So when tribal raiders, backed by the, let's say, nascent Pakistani army, tried to basically annex the region in 1947, the Maharaja made a choice.
He signed the Instrument of Accession with India.
He did. And that act legally cemented India's claim to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, fast forward past several conflicts, notably the 1971 war. That's when the line of control, the Lossi, was formally established.
Dividing Kashmir
Into Indian-administered areas, Jammu, the Kashmir Valley, and Ladakh and Pakistani-administered areas, which they call Azad Kashmir, and the northern areas.
And the geography right there in Ladakh, that's absolutely critical to understanding the Kargil plan. Just picture this. Ladakh's main lifeline, its connection to the rest of India, is basically one road.
National Highway 1A, the Srinagar-Leh Highway, 434 kilometers long.
And it's the only land route, really, that's open for a significant part of the year, but it's incredibly vulnerable.
Oh, incredibly. It has to snake its way very close to the Lossi, particularly near the Zojila Pass that's already at 11,600 feet, and crucially, right near the town of Kargil itself.
So if you can cut that road,
you isolate the entire region. You cut off supplies, reinforcements to Ladakh, and especially to the Indian troops stationed further up on the Siachen Glacier.
And that was the core military goal for Pakistan.
That was the central aim, yes.
Yeah.
Cut the highway, isolate Siachen, force India onto the back foot.
Now, this wasn't the first time Pakistan had tried something like this, was it? This pattern of military adventurism.
No, it's deeply ingrained. It goes back to the very beginning, 1947. Pakistan's ruling elite, especially the military, has consistently fostered this anti-India narrative. It reinforces the military's own position as the guardian, of the nation's ideology.
And we saw precursors.
Definitely. Look at the 1965 war. The strategy then infiltrate armed irregulars, then follow up with conventional forces that was essentially the blueprint, the model they dusted off for Kargil.
But something changed the game between 65 and 99, the nuclear factor. Pakistan tested its nuclear weapons in 98, following India's tests. How did that nuclear umbrella change their thinking? Did they really believe it gave them a free pass for conventional attacks below a certain threshold?
That seems to have been the pivotal calculation,
Right.
or miscalculation, rather.
Right.
The assumption was, and it proved spectacularly wrong, that possessing nuclear weapons would deter India from any major conventional retaliation, especially, crucially, any retaliation that involved crossing the line of control.
They thought India wouldn't dare escalate that far because of the nuclear risk.
That was the bet. They believed the nuclear threshold created a kind of safety zone for lower-level offensive actions. This thinking wasn't new either. It underpinned their long-running proxy war strategy in Kashmir.
Operation Topak.
Operation Topak, exactly. Launched around the time they acquired nuclear capability, let's say by 1987. The idea was to bleed India through continuous cross-border terrorism, fomenting insurgency. It was costly. Estimates put it around 5 crore rupees a month back then.
Wow. That's significant.
It is, but they saw it as manageable, sustainable, under the perceived safety net of nuclear deterrence.
So why the shift? Why escalate from that proxy war model, which was damaging but perhaps deniable, to a full-blown conventional intrusion like Operation Badr in Kargil? What were the specific drivers?
Well, it looks like a convergence of factors. First, there's a sense that the insurgency of the proxy war in Kashmir was actually losing momentum by the late 90s. Militancy was declining somewhat.
So they needed something dramatic to reignite the issue.
Possibly. Second, and this is key tactically, they saw an opportunity to seize really dominant strategic territory, those high-altitude peaks overlooking the highway. Ground that would be incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, for India to retake.
Giving them a permanent advantage?
That was the hope. And third, the bigger strategic picture. Internationalize the Kashmir dispute. By creating a major crisis, they aimed to force the world powers to step in, mediate, and pressure India into negotiations on Pakistan's terms.
So the military objectives were very clear. Cut the highway, isolate Siachen, force India to the table from a position of weakness.
Exactly. It was audacious.
And the audacity is just amplified by the diplomatic backdrop. The deception was extraordinary because Operation Badr wasn't just militants. It was planned and executed by Pakistani regulars, wasn't it?
Primarily, yes. Elements of the Northern Light Infantry, the NLI, which recruits heavily from those mountainous regions and is skilled in high-altitude operations. They were supported by some Islamic militants, yes, but the core force, the planning, the logistics, that was the Pakistani army.
And this was planned while the ink was barely dry on the Lahore Declaration, signed just 4 months earlier, February 1999. What exactly did that declaration promise?
Look, the Lahore Declaration was meant to be a landmark, a real confidence-building measure. It explicitly committed both India and Pakistan to dialogue, to resolving issues peacefully, to non-aggression, to avoiding military conflict.
Prime Minister Vajpayee had actually taken that bus trip to Lahore?
He had. The symbolism was huge. So the intrusion, which actually began during the winter months of 98-99 under the cover of heavy snow, it just shredded every principle agreed upon in Lahore.
They used the cover of winter, knowing India routinely vacated some of those high posts.
Precisely. There was this sort of unwritten understanding about vacating the most exposed posts during the harshest winter months. Pakistan exploited that vulnerability, that mutual understanding, for a massive, stealthy buildup. It was a fundamental violation of trust that had barely even begun to be established.
Militarily, that initial infiltration, achieving that level of surprise, it has to be seen as a major intelligence failure for India, right?
Oh, absolutely. A failure of the highest order. The Pakistani planners achieved what military strategists call utter surprise. The Indian army was, for weeks, completely unaware of the true scale and nature of what was happening.
When did the alarm bells finally start ringing?
Not really until early May 1999. The first warnings actually came from local shepherds, nomadic herders.
The Gujars and Bakarwals.
Yes. They reported seeing armed men, sometimes in unfamiliar uniforms, moving with heavy equipment in areas where they shouldn't be. These initial reports, unfortunately, were either dismissed or misinterpreted.
They thought it was just the usual small-scale militant infiltration.
That seems to have been the assumption.
Yeah.
It wasn't until Indian patrols were sent out to investigate, and some of those patrols went missing or were ambushed, that the military began to realize something much bigger was afoot. But even then, grasping the full scale took time.
And when they did figure it out, the scale was pretty shocking.
It was staggering. We're talking about Pakistani forces occupying strategic high points along a 150-kilometer stretch of the Losai, in the Dras sector, the Coxar sector, the Batalik sector.
And they weren't just on the Lasso, they were deep inside Indian territory.
Deep inside, encroachments ranging from 7 to 10 kilometers inside the Indian side of the line of control.
Yeah.
And crucially, at altitudes approaching, sometimes exceeding, 18,000 feet. That's 5,485 meters, almost Everest base camp heights.
And like you said, this wasn't just a handful of guys. This was a proper military operation.
Absolutely professional. Intelligence estimates eventually put the total force involved at around 1,700 men. That included several battalions of the NLI, elements of Pakistan's Elite Special Service Group, or SSG, alongside some Mujahideen fighters.
How did they even manage the logistics for that many troops that high up in secret?
They showed some remarkable innovative techniques for high-altitude logistics, specialized equipment, obviously. But critically, reports indicate they used helicopters quite extensively.
Helicopters for infiltration at that altitude.
For infiltration, for reconnaissance, for resupply. We're talking about machines like the aerospatial Puma and Llama helicopters. There were even reports, possibly related to reconnaissance near Siachen around the same time, of flights nearing 25,000 feet. They clearly had capabilities suited for that environment.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, maybe terrifying.
Yeah.
Because the enemy isn't just the NLI soldiers dug in on the peaks. It's the mountain itself. High-altitude combat is just different.
It's a different species of warfare altogether. The environment becomes an active adversary. It creates, literally, a zone of lethal pathology.
Lethal pathology, explain that.
Okay, think about oxygen. At sea level, you have normal air pressure. Go up to, say, 15,000 feet, around 4,500 meters. The partial pressure of oxygen, the amount your lungs can actually use, is about 40% less. The barometric pressure itself is halved compared to sea level.
So your body is starved of oxygen.
Constantly. If you ascend too quickly, without proper acclimatization, which takes weeks, not days, your body just can't cope. The first thing you get is acute mountain sickness, AMS, headaches, nausea, fatigue, debilitating.
But it's worse, right?
Much worse. The real killers are high-altitude pulmonary edema, HPE, where fluid builds up in your lungs, basically drowning you from the inside, and high-altitude cerebral edema, HAC, where your brain swells. HPE is actually the most common cause of non-battle death from altitude sickness.
So soldiers were literally fighting just to breathe, even before a shot was fired, and then you throw in the cold.
Extreme cold. Even in summer, nighttime temperatures on those peaks could plummet to -10, -11 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
That brings frostbite, severe chilblains, hypothermia. These were major sources of casualties.
Did the NLI suffer from this too? They were acclimatized, presumably?
They were better acclimatized, yes, being recruited from high-altitude areas. But even they weren't immune. Sources confirmed that the Pakistani forces suffered significant non-battle casualties during their initial build-up phase back in February and March '99. Avalanches, severe blizzards. Just existing up there is incredibly hard, let alone maintaining a fighting force through winter.
Okay, beyond the human body. How does this extreme environment affect the actual fighting? The weapons, the tactics?
Well, it degrades weapon performance, for one. The low air pressure slightly changes the ballistics, the aerodynamics of projectiles. It can affect accuracy and range, especially for artillery and aircraft ordnance. Needs careful calculation.
But the NLI had a massive advantage built in, didn't they?
They had the classic military advantage. They held the dominating heights. The mountains favored the defender, always. And they weren't just sitting on rocks. They spent months building fortified positions.
Jangars, they're called.
Sangars, yes. Basically, bunkers built from stone, often reinforced with concrete, dug right into the mountainside. Extremely difficult to spot, extremely difficult to destroy.
And they were well armed.
Very well armed. Standard infantry weapons, heavy machine guns, mortars.
Yeah.
But, critically, they brought portable anti-aircraft missiles, man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, things like the U.S.-made Stinger missile.
Stingers, wow, that's serious hardware.
Very serious. And those Stingers proved devastatingly effective against Indian air operations in the early days of the conflict. They scored hits almost immediately.
So you have this large, well-equipped, acclimatized force dug into fortified positions on commanding heights, armed with anti-aircraft missiles. How on earth did the Indian military leadership, the intelligence agencies, miss a buildup of this magnitude right on their doorstep?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer points to a catastrophic intelligence breakdown. Systemic failure.
How so?
Well, part of it was procedural. The Indian Army had this routine, as we mentioned, of vacating some of the highest, most exposed posts during the peak winter months. It was deemed too hazardous, too costly to maintain them year-round. They relied on periodic patrols and surveillance to monitor those gaps.
Leaving stretches of the Lassi effectively unmanned for periods.
Yes, potentially up to 80 kilometers of frontage, with only intermittent monitoring during the worst of winter. But the deeper failure, according to the Kargil Review Committee that investigated afterwards, was conceptual,
Meaning?
meaning the entire intelligence apparatus, RNAW, the Intelligence Bureau, military intelligence, their focus was overwhelmingly fixed on the ongoing insurgency within the Kashmir Valley. Cross-border shelling was common, yes. Militant infiltration was expected. But the possibility of a large-scale conventional intrusion by Pakistani regulars aimed at seizing and holding territory, that scenario was consistently discounted. It wasn't considered a realistic threat.
Even though there were historical precedents, like 65?
Even so, the mindset seemed to be that Pakistan wouldn't risk such a blatant move, especially maybe post-nuclear tests. They underestimated Pakistan's willingness to gamble.
We mentioned the shepherd's warnings being dismissed. Were there other signs missed?
Hindsight is always 20/20. But the review committee did point to deficiencies in interpreting surveillance data, maybe not connecting dots between different intelligence streams. There wasn't a single smoking gun intercept that was ignored, necessarily, but rather a failure to synthesize the available information and assess the intent behind Pakistani movements.
And this lack of awareness, this sort of denial, it seeped right up to the political level initially, didn't it?
It absolutely did. You had Defense Minister George Fernandez visiting the forward areas in mid-May 1999. He initially described the situation as sporadic infiltrations.
And famously said they'd be evicted in 48 hours.
Or the next 2 days, yeah. That statement, made with confidence at the time, perfectly illustrates how profoundly the true gravity of the situation, the presence of an entrenched army, not just a few scattered militants, was misunderstood by the Indian establishment in those crucial early days.
It must have been a brutal awakening when the first casualty reports started coming back from those initial patrols.
That's when reality hit hard. When units sent to investigate were ambushed, when soldiers started dying trying to figure out what was going on, that's when it became undeniable that this was something far more serious.
So when did the government officially recognize the scale and authorize a full military response?
The turning point was late May. By May 25, 1999, the evidence was overwhelming. The Cabinet Committee on Security, the CCS, India's highest decision-making body on security matters, finally met and gave the green light.
Permission to use the Army and the Air Force?
Yes. Full authorization to use military force, including air power, in a coordinated effort to push the intruders back. That decision formally launched Operation Vijay, the code name for India's overall counteroffensive, technically covering all operations from May 1st onwards, even those initial confused encounters.
Okay, so Operation Vijay is launched. India knows it's facing a major intrusion by Pakistani regulars, but they immediately face this huge strategic dilemma, right? To cross or not to cross the line of control.
It was the critical predicament. Militarily, the most logical, perhaps the easiest way to deal with the intruders would have been to cross the Law Sea behind them, cut off their supply lines in Pakistan-administered Kashmir, and trap them.
Makes sense tactically, hit their logistics base.
Absolutely. But the Indian government, under Prime Minister Vajpayee, made an extraordinarily disciplined political decision. They adopted a carefully calibrated strategy. The Indian armed forces would not cross the Law Sea.
Unless absolutely necessary.
The official line was unless necessary in the supreme national interest. But in practice, the line held. They committed to fighting the war entirely on India's side of the Law Sea, even though it meant fighting uphill, against fortified positions, which is the hardest kind of warfare imaginable.
Why? Why accept such a massive tactical disadvantage? It must have cost Indian lives?
It undoubtedly did. It made the task infinitely harder for the soldiers on the ground. But strategically and diplomatically, it turned out to be a masterstroke.
How so?
Because remember, Pakistan's calculation. They expected India to retaliate, perhaps even across the Law Sea. They believed this would trigger international alarm, bring in the major powers, and force a mediation on Kashmir, likely leading to a ceasefire that might leave Pakistani troops holding on to the territory they grabbed. That was their gamble.
And by not crossing the Law Sea.
India completely flipped the script. By restricting the conflict to its own territory, India framed Pakistan as a clear, unambiguous aggressor who had blatantly violated international law, the sanctity of the laws established under the Shimla Agreement, and the spirit of the Lahore Declaration.
So it became Pakistan's aggression versus India's restraint.
Precisely. This allowed India to mobilize international opinion against Pakistan. The U.S., the G8 countries, even China eventually urged Pakistan to withdraw. Pakistan found itself increasingly isolated diplomatically. India gained the moral high ground, and crucially, it avoided giving Pakistan the excuse it needed to internationalize the conflict in a way that might have led to an unfavorable premature ceasefire.
And it also kept the conflict below the nuclear threshold.
That was certainly part of the calculus, too. By demonstrating restraint, India signaled it wasn't seeking a wider war, reducing the risk of nuclear escalation, which Pakistan seemed to be banking on as a deterrent to any significant Indian response. It was politically astute, even if militarily agonizing.
Agonizing is probably the right word, for the troops rushed into battle initially. You mentioned they were unprepared.
Grossly unprepared in many cases. Units like the 8th Mountain Division were pulled directly from counterinsurgency operations in the Kashmir Valley, where the fighting is very different, and thrown into the high-altitude cauldron of Dras within weeks.
Without time to acclimatize properly.
Critically, without proper acclimatization. We're talking about moving troops rapidly from near sea level conditions up to 12,000, 14,000 feet or more, and expecting them to fight effectively almost immediately. The physiological toll was immense.
And they lacked the right gear, too.
Often, yes. Especially in the initial rush. There are well-documented accounts, for instance, of units like the 18 Grenadiers arriving in the battle zone without essential high-altitude sleeping bags. Can you imagine? Fighting at 15,000 feet without a proper sleeping bag?
Unbelievable. How did they manage?
The Army had to scramble. They ended up frantically transporting reserve stocks of specialized Siachen-grade glacial clothing and equipment, parkas, boots, sleeping bags, all the way from the Siachen sector down to Kargil, just to keep the troops functional, just to keep them alive before they even faced the enemy. It was a logistical nightmare, born from the initial surprise and rapid deployment.
And the tactical consequences of this lack of preparation.
Immediate and devastating. First, there was a huge spike in non-combat casualties. Remember, HAPE and HEAC? Acclimatization is key to avoiding them. Reports from the military hospital at Leh indicated that something like 26%, more than a quarter of the Indian soldiers evacuated there in the early stages, were suffering from severe cold weather injuries like frostbite and chilblains, casualties before combat.
And the initial attacks.
They largely stalled. The first assaults on key enemy positions, like the formidable Tololing Peak and the iconic Tiger Hill, were repulsed with heavy casualties. The Indian troops were attacking uphill, often in daylight initially, against well-entrenched enemies who held all the advantages of terrain and observation. The attacks often lacked sufficient firepower coordination or close air support in those early days. It was brutal.
So the Indian Army had to learn, adapt, and change its tactics, basically on the fly, under fire, in the worst possible conditions. What was the core shift? What did they figure out they needed to do differently?
The crucial realization, born from those bloody initial failures, was that these peaks couldn't be taken by conventional infantry assaults alone, especially not frontal ones. Success required a new doctrine, a combination of two key elements. First, overwhelming firepower, and second, bold vertical maneuver.
Overwhelming firepower. That sounds like artillery.
Primarily artillery, yes. Artillery became the king of the Kargil battlefield, and not just lobbing shells from afar.
Okay, explain that. What kind of artillery and how was it used differently?
The Indian Army brought in a significant number of artillery batteries. Estimates range from 20 to 22 batteries deployed across the sectors. The workhorse, and the real star, was the Bofors 155mm howitzer.
The Bofors gun. Famous from previous controversies, but effective here.
Incredibly effective.
Yeah.
But the way they used it was innovative, almost revolutionary for artillery. They started employing the Bofors guns in a direct firing role.
Direct fire. Like a giant rifle. I thought howitzers were for indirect fire, artising shells over mountains.
Normally, yes, indirect fire standard.
Yeah.
But think about the targets. Small, heavily fortified bunkers, often built right into the rock face of a near-vertical cliff. Hitting those accurately with shells lobbed on a high trajectory is extremely difficult due to the altitude, the wind, the sheer angle.
So direct fire offered more precision.
Exactly. By bringing the Bofors guns forward, sometimes dangerously close to the front lines, and sighting them manually directly onto the bunker target, the gunners could fire the shell on a much flatter trajectory. It hits the target with immense kinetic energy and much greater accuracy. It was technically challenging, pushing the gun's capabilities, but devastatingly effective for bunker busting.
And the psychological impact.
Immense. We know this from intercepted Pakistani radio communications. There's a famous intercept from an NLI soldier dug in on Tiger Hill, reporting back during a particularly intense barrage, saying simply, "Hell has fallen on us."
Wow.
The volume of fire was incredible. Before major infantry assaults like the one on Tiger Hill, Indian artillery would sometimes pound the peak with sustained barrages, firing maybe 1,200 rounds in just 5 minutes, suppressing the enemy, destroying bunkers, and paving the way for the second key element.
The bold vertical maneuver.
Yes. The infantry tactics had to change, too. Instead of attacking up known tracks or ridges, which the enemy expected and had covered with fire, the Indian light infantry units started attempting audacious, often nighttime, climbs up seemingly impossible cliff faces or along unexpected, treacherous routes to achieve surprise and attack the enemy positions from flanks or even the rear. It required incredible skill, courage, and endurance.
So this combination of massed artillery and daring infantry climbs became the key. And the first major test, the place where this new doctrine really had to prove itself, was the Tololing complex, wasn't it?
Tololing was absolutely pivotal. Standing at around 16,000 feet, it physically dominated the Dras sector and the vital Srinagar highway below. Psychologically, it cast a huge shadow. Its capture was deemed the essential first step before other objectives could be tackled. The priority sequence was clear. Secure Tololing first, then focus on the Batalik sector, and then clear Mushko and Koksar.
But taking Tololing proved incredibly difficult initially. Those early attacks were tragic failures.
They were. The NLI positions on Tololing were exceptionally well-sighted and fortified. They commanded all the obvious approaches. They could just sit tight in their sangars and rain down machine gun and mortar fire on any Indian troops attempting to climb.
We should remember the sheer bravery shown even in those failed attempts.
Absolutely. The story of Lieutenant Colonel R. Vishwanathan of 18 Grenadiers is emblematic. On May 28th, during one of those early, costly assaults, he was mortally wounded. But reports say he refused evacuation, continuing to direct his men and even charging toward enemy positions to inspire them before he finally collapsed.
An incredible act of leadership, even in defeat.
It was. But his sacrifice and the heavy casualties suffered in those initial attempts highlighted just how strong the enemy position was. The operation to take Tololing effectively stalled for nearly 2 weeks after that, underlining the urgent need for that complete tactical rethink.
Okay, so after the stalemate, how did they finally break the deadlock? What happened on the night of June 12th, 13th?
That was the turning point. The final successful assault was launched by 2 battalions, 2 Rajputana Rifles, RYJRF, and 18 Grenadiers. And it perfectly exemplified the new doctrine.
Massive artillery preparation first.
Massive and sustained. For about 6 hours leading up to the infantry assault, the artillery pounded the Tololing peak and surrounding enemy positions relentlessly. The aim was suppression to keep the defenders' heads down, disrupt their command and control, and hopefully destroy some of the forward bunkers.
And then the infantry went in.
Under the cover of darkness. And this wasn't a charge up an easy slope. This involved intense, close-quarters fighting, often literally hand-to-hand on incredibly steep, exposed terrain.
Can you describe what that climb and fight must have been like?
It's almost impossible to fully imagine. You're climbing near vertical rock faces, burdened with weapons and ammunition, in pitch-black darkness, freezing cold, starved of oxygen. Assault engineers often had to fix ropes to help the troops ascend certain sections. A slip could mean falling hundreds of feet, and all the while, knowing the enemy's waiting above, likely behind fortified positions.
And specific acts of heroism stood out.
Several did, but the actions of Major Vivek Gupta and Havildar Dijender Kumar of 2 ROJIF are often highlighted. They were tasked with capturing a key enemy bunker complex. Leading the charge, they advanced directly into intense automatic fire. Reports describe them reaching the first bunker, neutralizing the enemy soldiers inside through sheer aggression, despite taking heavy fire themselves. Havildar Dijender, though wounded, reportedly continued clearing bunkers.
Just unbelievable courage required to do that.
It secured the vital foothold. By around 6 a.m. on June 13, 1999, after a night of brutal fighting, Tololing Top was finally captured.
And the impact of that victory.
It was immense, absolutely pivotal. Militarily, it broke the NLI's stranglehold on the Dras sector. Psychologically, it was a massive boost to the morale of the Indian troops across the entire Kargil front. It proved that the enemy could be dislodged, that the new tactics worked.
And they didn't rest on their laurels?
No, the momentum was immediately exploited. Within days, Indian forces pushed on from Tololing to seize adjacent features, like Point 4590, often called the Hump, which then provided a crucial launch pad for the next major objective in the complex, point 5140. The tide had truly begun to turn in the Dras sector.
Okay, so Tooling falls, the momentum shifts. But the biggest, most symbolic, and arguably the most difficult objective remained: Tiger Hill, point 965 meters.
Tiger Hill, it just looms over the landscape there, a single steep conical peak that directly overlooks a critical stretch of the Srinagar Highway near Dras. Its strategic importance was obvious, but taking it was an enormous challenge.
Why was it considered even tougher than Tooling?
Several reasons. The peak itself is very prominent and isolated, offering excellent observation for the defenders. The slopes are incredibly steep, almost sheer in places. And the NLI positions on Tiger Hill were masterfully constructed and camouflaged. Indian intelligence initially underestimated the strength of the Pakistani defenses there. The bunkers were that well hidden. It was the absolute linchpin of the Pakistani defensive layout in the Dras sector. It had to be taken.
So how did they approach this final fortress? Was it the same doctrine, again, fire and maneuver?
Exactly the same doctrine, but perhaps executed with even more precision and on a larger scale, based on the lessons learned at Tololing. The final assault was launched primarily by troops from the 18 Grenadiers and 8 Sikh regiments.
And the artillery preparation.
Even more intense. Reports mention as many as 22 artillery batteries, that's over 100 guns, including Bofors, field guns, and mortars pounding Tiger Hill and its approaches continuously for days before and during the assault. Relentless, suppressive fire.
And the infantry assault itself.
It was incredibly daring. Launched on the night of July 3rd, 1999. The main assault involved a grueling 12-hour climb. And critically, they didn't attack up the expected routes. Instead, they chose an almost vertical cliff face on the eastern side, a route the defenders likely considered impossible to ascend, especially at night, and in poor weather, there was apparently freezing rain that night.
Climbing a cliff face in freezing rain under potential fire.
It required exceptional skill, mountaineering expertise from some elements, and just sheer grit. The aim was tactical surprise, hitting the enemy from an unexpected direction.
And this is the battle that's forever linked with Captain Vikram Batra, isn't it? Though his most famous actions were technically on adjacent peaks.
That's right. Captain Batra, of the 13 Jammu and Kashmir Rifles, had already become a hero for his actions in capturing point 5140 just weeks earlier. That's where his famous radio message came from after capturing the peak against heavy odds, he reported back. "Yeah, Dil mange more. This heart wants more." A soft drink slogan turned into a battle cry. But his ultimate sacrifice came slightly later, during the battle for point 4875 in the Mushko Valley sector, another key strategic feature near Tiger Hill. During that assault, he saw a fellow officer, a junior commissioned officer, JCO, pinned down by enemy fire and wounded. Batra moved to rescue him. The JCO reportedly tried to urge Batra to stay back, but Batra pushed him to safety, saying something to the effect of, "You have a family, kids to look after. I will handle this." He then charged the enemy position to silence the machine gun, pinning them down, and was killed in the process.
A story that just encapsulates the selflessness and leadership shown.
Absolutely. His bravery, and that of many others, contributed to the overall success. The multi-pronged assault on Tiger Hill, hitting the defenders from unexpected directions simultaneously while under that massive artillery bombardment, finally broke their resistance.
When was Tiger Hill finally secured?
By the morning of July 8, 1999, 18 Grenadiers and supporting units had seized Tiger Hill top. Though pockets of resistance on nearby spurs took a few more days to clear completely, the capture of the main peak marked the decisive end of major combat operations in the Dras sector. It signaled that India had regained the tactical initiative and was firmly on the path to victory.
While all this brutal fighting was happening on the ground, the Indian Air Force was engaged in its own battle operations safe to Sagar. They faced unique challenges too, didn't they? Thin air, those Pakistani surface-to-air missiles.
Huge challenges. The IAF initially faced some criticism for a perceived delay in joining the fight. Was that fair?
Largely unwarranted, I'd say. The IAF leadership rightly insisted on getting clear political authorization before launching offensive air operations. Using air power in that sensitive border environment, especially against a nuclear-armed neighbor, requires extreme political caution. You don't just send jets across the Lassi on a whim.
Right. But once they got the green light, the threat was immediate and lethal.
Absolutely. The price of entry was paid almost instantly. On May 27th, very early in the air campaign, an Indian Air Force MiG-27 fighter bomber went down over the Kargil Heights. Engine trouble initially reported?
Yes, attributed to engine failure at high altitude, possibly exacerbated by enemy ground fire. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Kanich Keita, had to eject, and was captured by Pakistani forces, becoming a prisoner of war for about 8 days.
And that wasn't the only loss that day.
No. Later that same day, a MiG-21 fighter, which was flying cover for helicopters, was shot down by a Pakistani man-pads, likely one of those Stinger missiles. The pilot, squadron leader Ajay Ahuja, was tragically killed.
So those early losses really proved the effectiveness of Pakistan's anti-aircraft defenses. They weren't just dug in, they were aggressively defending the airspace above their positions.
Definitely. It forced the IAF to adapt immediately. How did they counter that very real SAM threat without escalating things by, say, bombing SAM sites across the low sea?
They had to fundamentally change how they operated. The biggest change was imposing a hard deck, a minimum flight altitude for all fixed-wing combat aircraft.
Flying higher to stay out of range of the shoulder-fired missiles?
Exactly. They mandated flying above roughly 30,000 feet. This significantly reduced their vulnerability to the man-pads, which have limited altitude ceilings, but it came at a cost to accuracy.
A huge cost. Most of the IAF's strike aircraft at the time relied on dumb bombs, unguided munitions. Trying to hit a small camouflage bunker on a mountaintop from 30,000 feet with an unguided bomb is incredibly difficult. The thin air affects bomb trajectory, the release calculations are complex, initial accuracy was understandably low.
So how did they improve? What else did they adapt?
They had to get creative. They started using innovative techniques like high-altitude release, HAR bombing, trying to calculate release points more precisely using GPS navigation aids. Critically, they also transitioned to night operations.
Flying and bombing at night?
Yes. This made it much harder for the Pakistani gunners using optically sighted man-pads to acquire and track the Indian aircraft. It increased survivability, even if accuracy remained a challenge.
Did the Army on the ground feel the effects of the air support initially?
The initial psychological effect, the shock and awe, was significant. Intercepted enemy radio chatter confirmed they were unnerved by the intensity of the bombing, even if many bombs missed. Army reports from June, however, suggested that out of maybe 80 close air support missions flown, only about a dozen actually delivered ordnance close enough to the intended target to be considered effective.
So precision was the missing piece.
It was. The real game changer, later in the conflict, was the deployment of the IAS Mirage 2000 fighters equipped with laser-guided bombs, precision-guided munitions, or PGMs.
Smart bombs.
Exactly. The Mirage 2000s, using laser designation pods, could deliver these PGMs with pinpoint accuracy, even from high altitude. These proved crucial in taking out some of the most stubborn, heavily fortified enemy command posts and bunkers, especially on objectives like Tiger Hill, working in direct coordination with the ground assaults. That was when air power became truly decisive.
Okay, so while India was adapting militarily and starting to regain ground, Pakistan was pushing hard on the diplomatic front, weren't they? What was their strategy there?
Their diplomatic strategy had two main prongs. First, maintain plausible deniability. Continue insisting that the forces occupying the Kargil Heights were not Pakistani regulars, but genuine freedom fighters, or Kashmiri Mujahideen over whom Islamabad had no direct control.
Trying to portray it as an indigenous uprising.
Precisely. And second, use the crisis they had created to force international intervention, particularly mediation on the core Kashmir dispute. They wanted the world to step in and pressure India.
How well did that strategy work?
It collapsed remarkably quickly. The international community, and especially the United States, simply didn't buy the freedom fighter narrative.
Why not?
The evidence was just too strong, the scale of the operation, the equipment being used, the intercepted communications, the sheer military professionalism. It all pointed clearly to the involvement of the Pakistani army. The U.S. administration, under President Clinton, publicly stated that they believed Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's government did control the forces that had crossed the Law Sea.
So the U.S. basically called their bluff.
They did. The U.S. acknowledged that the crisis originated directly from Pakistan's military adventurism across the Law Sea. This was a huge diplomatic blow to Pakistan.
And this culminated in that famous meeting in Washington.
Yes, the Washington Agreement on July 4th, 1999. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, facing mounting military pressure on the ground and increasing diplomatic isolation, made a sudden visit to Washington to meet President Clinton.
Seeking U.S. help to broker a ceasefire?
He was likely hoping for some face-saving way out. But the U.S. position was firm. President Clinton essentially demanded, not requested, that Pakistan withdraw all its forces back to its side of the line of control, unconditionally.
No linkage to Kashmir talks.
No linkage at that point. The immediate priority was ending the aggression and restoring the sanctity of the Law Sea. The U.S. played an absolute vital role in diffusing the crisis but on terms that validated India's position. Pakistan emerged from the Washington meeting diplomatically cornered. Its credibility was shot. India's decision to maintain restraint and not cross the Law Sea had paid off handsomely on the world stage.
Before we wrap up the conflict itself, we really need to touch on the human dimension again. Not just the soldiers, but the civilians caught in the middle, the support personnel. What was life like for ordinary people in Kargil town during this?
It must have been terrifying. Kargil town itself, though miles from the highest peaks being fought over, came under regular Pakistani artillery shelling. Eyewitness accounts describe shells hitting civilian areas, including prominent buildings like the official circuit house and the superintendent of police's bungalow. Life was completely thrown out of gear.
And those small, poignant details.
Yeah, they stick with you, like the accounts of journalists and soldiers lining up, queuing at the single functioning public telephone booth, the STD booth in Kargil town. Each person waiting for their turn to make a quick call home, maybe talk to family, offer some reassurance, or perhaps say a quiet goodbye before heading up into the mountains. It just highlights the raw anxiety, the human cost underneath the military operations.
And the local population living closer to the Lasi, they were displaced, weren't they?
Massively displaced. Official figures suggest over 31,000 people, mostly the local Balti population, were forced to flee their homes in villages near the Lasi due to the shelling and fighting. They had to abandon their houses, their livestock, their fields.
And this happened right during their crucial agricultural season.
Exactly. Ladakh has a very short growing season, typically May to September. The conflict erupted right in the middle of it, devastating their livelihoods. The government set up relief camps, providing basic rations, things like 7 kilograms of rice, 2 kilograms of flour per family per month. But reports suggest these were often insufficient. It was a humanitarian crisis alongside the military one.
And finally, the medics, treating horrific injuries in those conditions.
Their courage and resourcefulness were extraordinary. The regimental aid posts, the first point of medical care near the front lines, were often set up in makeshift shelters, sometimes under massive boulders for protection from the constant shelling.
Treating what kinds of injuries? At 16,000 feet.
Everything. Traumatic amputations from shell fire, severe bullet wounds, frostbite, hypothermia, altitude sickness, all compounded by the extreme environment. Evacuation was incredibly difficult and dangerous. They relied heavily on the bravery of the Army aviation helicopter pilots.
Flying cheetah helicopters, right. Not exactly robust machines.
Light, frail helicopters, often described by observers as landing with literally one ski on the ledge of a precarious mountain slope, under potential enemy fire, just long enough to pick up a critically wounded soldier. Those pilots saved countless lives, battling not just the enemy but the altitude and the weather too. It was heroism all around.
So the fighting gradually subsided after the capture of Tiger Hill and other key peaks, and with the diplomatic pressure mounting on Pakistan following the Washington Agreement, Operation Vijay was formally declared successful and terminated when?
On July 26, 1999, Indian forces had successfully evicted the intruders from all occupied positions on the Indian side of the Lak-Asi. Victory was declared.
But at a heavy cost. What were the final casualty figures?
The official Indian figures were 474 soldiers killed and around 1,100 wounded. For Pakistan, estimates vary, as they initially denied involvement of their regulars, but most credible assessments put their losses significantly higher, possibly around 700 killed, including regulars and militants. The cost in human lives on both sides was immense, especially considering the limited territorial gains Pakistan initially made and ultimately lost.
And the fallout within Pakistan, this defeat, this forced withdrawal, must have had huge internal repercussions.
Massive. The Kargil fiasco dramatically intensified the already existing tensions between Pakistan's civilian government under Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and the powerful military establishment led by Army Chief General Pervez Musharraf, who was widely seen as the main architect of the Kargil intrusion.
Musharraf basically blamed Sharif for buckling under U.S. pressure.
That was the narrative the military pushed. The humiliation of the withdrawal, combined with existing political instability and economic problems, created the conditions for Musharraf to launch a military coup just a few months later, in October 1999. He overthrew Nawaz Sharif and seized power. So Kargil directly contributed to another period of military rule in Pakistan.
Looking back at the strategic level, those JNU assessments and other analyses, what did they conclude about Pakistan's core premise? Did the nuclear umbrella strategy fail?
Utterly. The Kargil conflict demonstrated quite clearly that possessing nuclear weapons does not automatically grant immunity for conventional military aggression below the nuclear threshold. Nuclear weapons are strategic deterrents against existential threats, against all-out war, but they prove tactically useless in preventing India from launching a determined, conventional military response to reclaim its own territory.
Because India kept its response conventional and limited to its side of the law.
Exactly. India's strategic restraint, denying Pakistan the escalation it perhaps sought, combined with its overwhelming conventional military superiority applied locally within the conflict zone, completely defeated Pakistan's strategic hypothesis. The nuclear umbrella couldn't stop the Bofors guns or the infantry charges up the mountains.
But does this conflict offer any solution to the larger Kashmir issue?
Sadly, no. If anything, Kargil reinforced the painful truth that many analysts had already pointed out. There is likely no purely military solution to the complex political dispute over Kashmir. The conflict's roots, as many analyses suggest, lie deeper arguably within Pakistan's own internal dynamics, its ongoing crisis of national identity, and the military's enduring influence in its politics. Kargil was a symptom, not the cause.
Okay, let's shift to the crucial operational lessons learned, especially for India's future defense posture. That complete and total surprise, what did that teach the Indian military and intelligence establishment?
It was a brutal wake-up call. The Kargil Review Committee report, which came out afterwards, was scathing about the intelligence failures. It highlighted major deficiencies across the board in collecting intelligence, in properly collating and analyzing it, and crucially, in assessing Pakistan's intentions. They recommended a complete overhaul of the national intelligence structure.
Specific changes.
Things like better institutionalized coordination between the different agencies, RNAW, external intelligence, the IB, internal, military intelligence, better technical surveillance capabilities, and perhaps most importantly, a need to improve analytical skills, to think outside the box and not just focus on existing threats, but anticipate potential new forms of aggression.
And what about equipment? Kargil clearly exposed some major gaps there, too.
Absolutely. It showed that Indian forces were, in some respects, ill-equipped for high-altitude modern warfare. Troops lacked sufficient specialized clothing and gear initially. There was a shortage of surveillance equipment. This led to an urgent push for modernization.
What were the top priorities?
Technical monitoring of the locket became paramount. This meant finally acquiring technologies that had been discussed for years but never fully implemented. Things like high-altitude unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, or drones for persistent surveillance over those remote mountain areas.
To watch those posts even when they are unmanned?
Precisely. And deploying ground sensors, optical cameras, thermal imagers, motion detectors that can be left in place at vacated winter posts to provide early warning of any intrusion. The Kargil Committee also strongly recommended a significant hike in the defense budget, suggesting it should be raised to around 3 to 3.5% of GDP to fund this essential modernization.
So a big push towards technology, surveillance, early warning. But despite all that, does the fundamental nature of high-altitude combat change? You mentioned comparing Kargil to later conflicts.
It's a fascinating point, because even with advanced technology, high-altitude warfare seems to remain, at its core, the domain of the light infantry soldier. If you look at Operation Anaconda in Afghanistan in 2002, where U.S. forces faced al-Qaeda fighters dug into high mountain terrain, many of the tactical lessons were remarkably similar to Kargil.
Such as?
Technology helps, yes. Precision air power, better communication, surveillance, they're all valuable force multipliers. But ultimately, dislodging a determined enemy from fortified positions on high ground still comes down to the basics. Overwhelming firepower, primarily artillery, to suppress and destroy defenses, used in close concert with bold, physically demanding infantry maneuver, often vertical maneuver along unexpected routes, frequently at night. The soldier on the ground, their training, their acclimatization, their endurance, and their courage that remains the decisive factor. Precision weapons alone don't win mountain battles. Boots on the ground, climbing those peaks still do.
So we've journeyed through the audacious surprise attack, the almost unbelievable physical hardship of fighting at 18,000 feet, the critical moments where tactics had to adapt under fire, and the careful diplomatic maneuvering that ran alongside the military campaign. It's a story of immense cost, strategic miscalculation, but also incredible fortitude and adaptation.
Absolutely. I think for anyone listening, the Kargil conflict really stands as a stark lesson. A lesson in how strategic assumptions, like Pakistan's reliance on the nuclear umbrella, can be dangerously flawed. A lesson in the critical importance of specialized training, equipment, and acclimatization for high-altitude operations. And perhaps most significantly, a lesson in the power of strategic restraint and disciplined diplomacy when it's backed by credible, adaptable, conventional military resolve. India's victory wasn't just about military might. It was about the combination of tactical adaptation on the ground, artillery dominance, diplomatic skill, and ultimately the sheer physical and moral tenacity of the soldiers fighting uphill.
Which leaves us, as always, with a final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to mull over, building on everything we've discussed. We heard about the push for technology after Kargil UAVs, sensors, better surveillance, all designed to prevent another surprise intrusion, especially during those winter months when posts might be vacated. So the question is, can technology ever truly eliminate the vulnerability created by vacating strategic high-altitude posts in winter? Or will the sheer scale, the unpredictability, the harshness of the high mountains always offer a potential gap, a temporary blind spot that an adversary might be tempted to exploit for tactical surprise? Will the mountains always hold that advantage? What stands out to you?